I'd like to use Professor Muraca's article, Possibilities for Degrowth, a radical alternative to the neoliberal restructuring of growth societies, as a catalyst for a discussion on critique of utopian desire. So chapter 3 of Future of Degrowth is on critique of growth, but I think the acid of critique sometimes eats through its container and burns the critic and the thing critiqued. So I want you to think of this presentation as a critique of growth and degrowth together. So I'll start with Fordism. Professor Muraca talks about Fordism briefly in our last class. It's this post-World War II growth mindset. It comes with a whole set of promises and anxieties, and essentially it's a kind of pact between capital, or the owners of the means of production, and state, and capital contributes to a social welfare state. This is the kind of nutshell view of Fordism. And what I'd like you to keep in mind here is that some theorists on the political left did support Fordism. They considered it, well, we can consider it as a productivist social democratic growthism. So Fordism in some form was desirous to some utopian leftists. I want that to be the main point here. We can look at Fordism's anxieties behind its promises. I think its promises are inseparable from its anxieties, its desires from its fears. So unfortunately for Fordism, it promised too much and it failed too often. So in its collapse, let's say, new desires were formed. And this is the kind of neoliberal reshuffle of the 70s and 80s. What happened, according to Professor Muraca, is there was capital saturation of domestic markets, there was an instability of the international monetary system, and on the better side, working class struggles had made some economic wins or gains. But I think Professor Muraca points out that one of the biggest turns away from Fordism and the social democratic view with social welfare policies and social mobility and all that was a discontent with the concept of central bureaucracy. As Muraca writes, quote, "It is not only the explicit hostility of the economic elite against redistribution policies, high taxation, and labor market regulation that fueled neoliberal sympathies. In a sense, a certain weariness of the centralized bureaucratic state and the surfacing recalcitrance against the dull system of production that generates alienation and suffocates creativity inspired new forms of social critique of capitalism more inclined to welcome a turn towards narratives of self-realization and the diversification of work," end quote. So the idea is Fordism grew stale, neoliberalism offered this kind of new hope and a new paradigm. It promised sustainable development, well-managed growth, and I put here more equality. And I frame the equity promise as a promise of more equality rather than, like in the Fordist slide, low inequality, to show how narrative erasures work. We don't speak of inequality or of deficit here. We speak of addition, more. We have added equality to the already existing surplus of equality. We're growing equality. To quote Professor Muraca on the neoliberal, quote, triggering of structures of desire, in its schizophrenic nature, neoliberalism liberates desire beyond the strict requirements of its mode of production, but also constantly tries to reincorporate it by tapping into its productivity. This is even more evident today with the functioning of social media orchestrated around flows of desire, parentheses for recognition, sociality, affection, appearance, and so on, and also flows of fear, of anonymity, social blaming, solitude, etc. The underlying logic, to continue Muraca's quote, the underlying logic is not only that of more, but also of better. Now, Muraca sees Foucault as attracted at some point, to some degree, to neoliberal promises. So Foucault, as neoliberalism seems open to any desire, including queer desire. So this may have attracted Foucault towards the neoliberal paradigm, just like under Fordism, there were some on the left who were attracted to it. Now, just to go through, we can talk about neoliberal anxieties, but sustainable development, Muraca refers to the fear of pauperization well-managed growth, fear of stagnation. These aren't one-to-one, but generally this is the shadow side of the promises, are these anxieties, the things you don't want to happen. Okay, now let's step back. I'm going to explore the idea of utopianism now. So we'll start with the social imaginary. Professor Muraca defines it as a deep collective self-understanding that legitimizes and confers sense to institutions and practices. Here I put that as number one. This is the whole tree, the whole social imaginary. And a subset of this tree, the crown or canopy, represents discourses in the social imaginary about utopias or utopianism, and including dystopias. All talk of ideal social organizations, or even better, or disorganizations. So as part of the social imaginary, utopian discourse plays its own various functions in legitimizing and conferring sense to institutions and practices. So that's the tree, that's the leaf part, number two. Number three, finally, is concrete utopias. This is the topmost part of the crown on this image. And among utopian discourse, the concrete utopia is a thing that creates real anticipations. It finds embodiment in prefigurative activism and, quote, to quote Muraca, actively seizes the potentials and transformations in the present. So concrete, literally like the material metaphor, it's here, it's tangible. It's contrasted in Muraca's work with abstract utopias, which are, quote, merely wishful thinking and, quote, operate as palliative against daily alienation. So this is just a quick kind of subset view of social imaginary, utopian discourse, and concrete utopias. And as I understand the concept, social imaginaries become shared, habitualized, normalized, naturalized, according to various socioeconomic situations. So, Fordist modes of social operation and production will grow and naturalize their own social imaginary. Neoliberal modes grow and naturalize their own social imaginary, and so on for various such modes. To some degree, it seems argued that these social imaginaries, or mental infrastructures to use another term, are mutually unintelligible. Maybe not, but that could be a factor. So concrete utopias are constituted out of these various social imaginaries, or out of their respective narrative allowances within utopian discourse. So what is possible, what is probable, and what is a good or desirable life are questions posed inside these social imaginaries, answers crystallized around the respective norms and ontologies of these trees, which I have here circled in yellow at the top. What is probable and desirable in the Fordist imaginary may seem impossible and monstrous in let's say, a peasant imaginary. So the question of desiring comes up again. Muraca, citing Ruth Levitas, claims that, quote, an essential function of utopias is the education of desire. And that's the key word here, utopian desire. There's an education of desire. Now, after this, there's a neoliberal revolution, and then historically there's this reemergence of growth critiques that Professor Muraca mentions, such as indigenous critiques, peasant critiques, feminist critiques. They involve new social imaginaries, so new narrative allowances for utopian discourse, which, like past utopian discourse, means new promises, new desires, and new anxieties. Now recall the Muraca quote from earlier about flows of desire and flows of fear in relation to neoliberal modes of subjection and production. Flows of desires and fears continue under various degrowth proposals for social transformation. Desires are leading us to degrowth. At least they lead me to degrowth, just as they led others to Fordism and Foucault to some hope in neoliberalism. So degrowth, like Fordism before and like neoliberalism today, aims to restructure social life and consequently the social imaginary and consequently our utopian narratives. It may be fair to say that degrowth wishes to re-educate our desires. But as Muraca wrote of neoliberalism's seeming advantages, for example, freedom of choice, these promises may be, quote, at the same time the seductive lure of the new paradigm and its most insidious trap. So it can play a double role. So degrowth makes promises, radical democracy, collective autonomy, solidarity. How do the promises of degrowth create, reveal, or exacerbate desires and fears? To borrow Marx's joke, to do critique of critical degrowth criticism, what fears, anxieties, and disappointments are we now fueling or setting up when we entertain degrowth promises? Are we like Foucault on the eve of a neoliberal revolution? So what's the dark side of degrowth desire? What are the fears here? And I want to end with a question that's related to this idea of fear, desire, and hope, and vision, and utopian desire. It seems to me that resistance and radical vision or utopian vision can be separated, and sometimes maybe they should be separated. You can resist X without knowing of an option outside of X. Professor Muraca, agreeing with Foucault, writes that resistance is not simply antagonistic negation, but a creative process. But I wonder, how creative does someone who resists have to be to count as participating in resistance? Or flipping the accusation, perhaps Foucault was too creative in his vision of neoliberal governmentality. So I'd like to pose a question for discussion. Is there a degrowth advocate, or can there be a degrowth advocate who makes no promises, not about solidarity or any of that, who critiques and resists without visions, without hopes? Is there a kind of tree, to use our image earlier, without utopian leaves? Is there a degrowth absurdist, the way that Camus thought of the absurdist? Struggles without hope.